All right, students, this week in jazz history, we begin the decade of the Roaring 20s, often called the Jazz Age. This decade can be summarized into these three words: peace, prosperity, and prohibition. So, this is what we're looking at that's happening in society and culture during the Roaring 20s that will help you understand the music that you'll be listening to. First of all, we have peace. World War One was over. America had entered World War One in 1917, and by 1920 we were done. We were out of it. So there was a huge feeling of relief, and it was kind of like really marked an end to a lot of turmoil that had been happening for the past couple of years. So America sees peace, and with that peace, America found prosperity. Um, Before World War One, America was a pretty rural, agricultural nation. Only a couple of cities. Most of America was very small towns. But World War One, America came out pretty strong, almost a superpower. This new thing called the stock market, people started to get into and investing. People were making money. People were able to buy things, and America was doing really well economically. Prohibition was huge. Prohibition was an amendment passed after many years of people wanting to get it passed, where it was they outlawed alcohol. It was a crime in America to drink any kind of booze, liquor, beer, anything. So what happened is once prohibition was passed, that opened up the way for thousands and thousands of speakeasies where people could show up and drink illegally. It opened up the alcohol business to gangsters, where they started selling alcohol, on the black market. And so what ended up happening is more than any other time in history, people started to drink more, once the government said you can't do it. So prohibition marks this era. And it was really important for jazz because once you had all these illegal speakeasies opening up, they all had live music, because if you were doing something that you weren't supposed to be doing with a bunch of people doing the same thing, you were out there for the party. Now, 1917 kind of marks the beginning of the jazz age for a couple of reasons. One, Scott Joplin died in 1917, so that the ragtime era ended. Remember, ragtime was America's most popular music from about 1899 to 1917. That was what America really was listening to. So Scott Joplin died, the ragtime era was finished. In 1917, you had the first jazz record by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. Totally changed the way Americans listened to music, and totally changed the dancing and, I guess, the courtship of a male and female, and the kind of dancing that they were doing and the kind of socializing that was being done. In 1917, America entered World War One. Very tumultuous time, and of course, when the war ended, we were in the prosperous 20s. The women's suffrage movement was huge. Prior to 1920, women did not have the right to vote. They were kind of second-class citizens. Well, women got the right to vote. It kind of changed the way females saw themselves in American culture, and it ended these Victorian era sensibilities. And what do I mean by Victorian era? Well, we'll discuss that a little bit. But what you got with the jazz age beginning, also 1917, Storyville closed. Remember, Storyville was the prostitution center in New Orleans, brought millions of people a year to go visit, and brought live music to the entire city. But once Storyville closed, there was no reason for musicians to stay in New Orleans anymore. Between that and black musicians, and actually all black people fleeing Jim Crow laws, everybody left New Orleans. You know, the music business in New Orleans just about died, and everybody moved to the Great Migration north into the cities of Chicago and New York. Now, when the Jazz Age began, you saw these technological and scientific advancements. Before 1917, you know, you go anywhere in America in 1899, 1900, very rural, very agrarian, just a couple of cities. It was the heartland, you know, you a million miles away from your next door neighbor. But the Jazz Age sees the beginning of air flight, recording industry, automobiles, the telephone. Margaret Sanger um, uh, advocated birth control for women. Sigmund Freud talked about, you know, the analysis of the human mind. So a lot of really forward-looking things started to happen in the 1920s. Very importantly, there was a new sexual morality and a new feminine ideal. The 20s was the decade of flaming youth, in the sense that these were young people. I guess, you know, the adults saw the young people were on the fast ride to nowhere. They thought the youngsters, when I say youngsters, teenagers and adults in their 20s, didn't want to do anything but have good times and party, and they said they were going to burn themselves out. And it was also the age of the flapper, for a feminine ideal. And the 1920s female was quite different than the pre-1920s female. The Victorian woman, from about 1890 to 1917, this was kind of the fashion, very, very modest. Took a lot of time, and the Victorian woman was seen a certain way. She was a wife and a mother, and that kind of deal. Wore billion tons of clothing. And the Jazz Age woman totally shed those images. And the way the Jazz Age woman thought about things was, well, if the guys got to play hard, they got to drink and smoke and party, why couldn't the women? So they got rid of their mother's fashions, and they decided, we are going to have an entirely new kind of fashion. We're going to have our own identity. So you get the flapper. Now, jazz music in the 1920s, you had various things going on. You still had the small group jazz, where it was the real jazz of guys like Louis Armstrong and these other New Orleans musicians who came up and found ways to make jazz in the clubs, dance halls, and cabarets of Chicago and New York. You had what was called pseudo jazz, and these are these huge dance orchestras, and they played highly arranged music with little moments of jazz improvisation. And Paul Whiteman, at the time, led the most famous dance orchestra, and it was so famous he was called the King of Jazz. And Paul Whiteman wanted to elevate jazz. He thought jazz was an amazing music, but he thought it could be America's classical music. So he commissioned George Gershwin to write a classical piece called Rhapsody in Blue that used a lot of jazzy kind of things. But again, it was not meant to go that way. Louis Armstrong's recording made jazz go the way of still solo work rather than what Paul Whiteman wanted it to do, and turn it into a classical music. But for a lot of people in America, the pseudo jazz was really the only jazz they ever heard or danced to. You had something called Chicago-style Dixieland. And that's where these young white musicians, teenagers and musicians in their early 20s, they loved the jazz they were hearing on records. They wanted to form their own bands. Their heroes were the black bands. So they tried to emulate the black New Orleans bands, but they kind of changed things up a bit. They got rid of the banjo and had a guitar instead. They got rid of the tuba and added a string bass. They added a saxophone to the mix, and the sax became a very popular instrument in the 1920s. And they kind of got away from the New Orleans street beat and started to swing the music more. A street beat being like bunk, dunk, dunk, bunk, 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 dunk, dunk, bunk, bunk, and the swings are and Louis Armstrong introduced that swing rhythm to the world. So these young white musicians all wanted to form their own garage jazz bands, if you will. Two cities that were huge during the Roaring '20s were Chicago. When the Great Black Migration occurred, that was the first stop in the north, Chicago. And then they continued on to New York, where the whole city was on fire all the time. Recording industries were up there. And of course, with Broadway and cabarets and dance halls, and both Chicago and New York had thousands of speakeasies. Lots of work for jazz musicians. You will be introduced this week to the genius Bix Beiderbecke. And Bix was one of the young white musicians who fell in love with this music, wanted to play it more than anything. He's the first great white jazz musician. And during the 1920s, he and Louis Armstrong were the ways. And he showed an entirely different approach to playing jazz solos than Armstrong did. And he was the first jazz musician to explore complex harmonies. Bix was an alcoholic. He died tragically young. And he kind of became the romanticized version of the jazz musician. And kind of a representation of the young people in the 20s, the ones who are just out there to live life and just party it up. You will meet his friend, Frank Trumbauer. He played with Bix Beiderbecke on many of these recordings, and he's one of the first jazz sax players, one of the first. And along with Bix, he recorded some of the greatest jazz albums of the 20s, and you will hear one of those on your video assignments. You will also be introduced to the Harlem Renaissance, which obviously occurred in Harlem, a neighborhood in New York. And the Harlem Renaissance was a great cultural event in American history. It was a flowering of African American political activism, intellectualism, creativity. All these black writers, artists, and musicians contributed to basically an empowerment of a black culture and kind of showing America we are a people that can create these amazing artistic and politically relevant ideas. Harlem saw a dominant jazz piano style called Harlem Stride, and stride piano became the jazz piano for about 20 years, from the 20s up until the beginning of the 1940s. It's a virtuosic style, and they call it stride because the left hand is constantly striding against the right hand improvisation. So you have a video assignment of that. Some of these Harlem Stride piano players, James P. Johnson, he was part of the Harlem Renaissance, and he was a composer, a conductor, an arranger, an all-around musician, but he is the father of stride piano, this new jazz piano style, which is really the first jazz piano style. And you will meet Fats Waller, who was a famous stride pianist, entertainer, and songwriter, one of the most popular entertainers of the 1920s and 30s. So that's a little introduction to the week. You got some fascinating assignments. Hope you enjoy them. And good luck. Talk to you later.